All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Brian Brown. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Let's get right into it. Let's talk about this Bigfoot thing. Let's talk about Sasquatch.
Yeah.
I always ask the same question just about of everybody who comes on the show. What got you interested in the subject to begin with?
For me, I think it's a couple of things. I grew up in Southern California, so I wasn't in Northern California. But if you were in California, I grew up in the 70s in California, and Bigfoot was just everywhere back then. And it was just permeating the culture. So I was aware of the animal when I was a kid. Of course, there was Boggy Creek. I'm sure everyone my age, that's one of the first things they'll mention is Boggy Creek. I didn't sit right on the toilet for years after that movie came out. There was a window next door to me or sitting next to me. But I think the most important thing for me was I got a copy of John Green's Sasquatch Files when I was really young. We were on a road trip and I just sat in the back of the car, I remember, and I read that book. It's not really a book. It's like a thick pamphlet, really. And I read that cover to cover again and again. That was really what set me off, was John Green.
I was just sitting here before we hopped on and I talked to Todd Prescott. He's graciously allowing me to use some of the audio from some of the more rare interviews with Patterson and Gimlin, some of the other things on the Sasquatch archives that he got from the John Green collection. And that story in and of itself is just fascinating. John Green is probably one of my favorite Bigfoot researchers of all time. Anything related to John Green, I'm all about. So I'm putting together a really cool show about the PG film, and we're going to hopefully use some of that audio. So we'll have that coming up in the next couple of weeks. So you did all that as a kid. When did you actually get into the boots on the ground? Was an experience that drove you into something else?
It was something else. It was just that I was interested in it. My interest waned as I got older, and it's a funny story. I've told it before, but my wife was cleaning out our home office back in 2001, 2002, something like that, and she had this big trash bag full of crap, and on top of it was this John Green book with Sasquatch Files, and I was like, "What are you doing? You can't throw that away," and because that book came out like in 1973 or some crazy thing like that, and I'm like, "No, you can't throw that away." So I grabbed it out of the trash. If I had not walked in, it would have been gone forever. My life would have been so different. And it just rekindled my interest. And so at that point, the web was really turning into a thing. I had recently gotten a job building websites. So I was really thinking about that as a medium. And also back then, this was before social media, right? There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no nothing. But what we did is there was internet forums. And so I'm like, well, there must be, I was a member of many forums, mostly like tech forums, like Mac forums and things like that. I'm like, there's gotta be forums out there about Bigfoot so I can talk to people about this. Because I was in Minnesota at this point. Like, as far as I was concerned, there were no Bigfoot within 1,500 miles of me. And so I went looking I remember I typed in bigfootforums.com and there was nothing there. And that just blew my mind that there was no bigfootforums.com. So I went and I registered bigfootforums.com. I set up some free forum software on my computer in my basement. And that was it. I wanted to talk to people and learn about this phenomenon. And that's really what started the whole thing. It was just a gnawing interest as an adult at this point in the subject, wanting to talk to people, wanting to create community around it. And the Bigfoot Forums is what introduced me eventually. The Bigfoot Forums was listed on Yahoo, this is before Google. We got listed the same day as the old TBRC, Craig Woolheater's organization, which eventually turned into the NAWAC. And so I got to know Craig a little bit because we shared that little bit of connection. And eventually that got me out to the International Bigfoot Symposium in Willow Creek, which I think was in 2003. And then that introduced me to Alton Higgins in the parking lot of the Bigfoot Motel. Once I met Alton, that got me an invitation to hang out with the TBRC folks. Like I said, that's what they were called back then. And that got me into Area Y. That got me into areas of Oklahoma that Alton was spending time in, and eventually into Area X. So it was that interest to connect to people and want to talk to people about the subject that eventually got me into Area X.
How long did it take you once you were out there in the woods with these people? Because I've talked to several people, had Daryl Collier on, Michael Mays. I just did a Bob Strain interview. I've talked to Kathy Strain before. Some of the experiences that they had in those areas was pretty crazy. Like they're out there, boots on the ground, first hour, they're having visual sightings of these things. How long did that take to pop off for you once you got out there in the woods in those areas?
Long time. Actually, the first time I went into the woods because of Bigfoot, because I was looking for wood apes or thinking about them, was with Bob Strain. He was my introduction. And I'm a city boy. I'm from Southern California, a lifelong Dodger fan. I didn't know anything about camping. I didn't know anything about forests or mountains or anything. And so Bob was extraordinarily kind after the symposium. He took me and a couple other guys to Louse Camp, where Roger and Bob were camping when they made the famous film. And so I got to spend a little time there. That was the first time in my life I had been out in the woods, in my life, sleeping in a tent. I was scared to death just because it was so dark. I think the first time I was in Area X was 2007. So it was a good 4 years later, something like that, where I got into an area, and I had been going out. We went to like Skookum Meadows and place like that. So I had been going out, but until nothing really significant had happened in all that time until I got to Area X. And that first weekend, I think it was 2007, I was in there for a long weekend and I didn't see anything, but we heard a lot of weird things. I heard a whoop. We heard boulders getting chucked around. There was stuff going on for sure. But that was really the first time that I had an experience that I thought was really interesting and potentially an ape.
What was some of the most memorable things that happened to you out doing the research, whether it was at Area X or anywhere else, when you got to interact with these wood apes? What were some of the things that stuck out to you, some of the experiences that you had that have stuck with you all this time?
I recently made a list and I realized that I didn't really even know how many times I think I've seen an ape. And so I made the list and it's about 12 times, and 2 of them in particular. Some of them are just real fleeting. So they're probably apes, but I don't know for an absolute fact. But I think that one of the most intriguing things that happened down there, I was in there one night with my friend Rich, who's from Great Britain, and Daryl Collier. The 3 of us were sitting around camp and it was pitch black. We didn't have a fire going or anything. And Rich, who has this like supernatural night vision, he can see things in the dark that no one else can. He picked up, it was just a real faint glimmer of eye shine of an animal that appeared to be holding onto a tree and had climbed up a tree and was looking at us from behind a tree. And he could see this thing's eye shine. And dude, it was so dark. I couldn't see anything with my naked eye, but I had night vision. And so I held up my night vision and sure enough, I could see right where he was saying there were 2 little dots, 2 little glowing dots. Daryl had a thermal scope that was handheld at that point. And he looked up there and sure enough, bright as day, you could see this round head. It was holding onto a tree, so it was looking around. From our perspective, it was looking on the sort of left side of the tree at us. And the crazy thing is, on the thermal, you could actually see its fingers on the opposite side of the tree, and they were moving because that went on for 20 minutes. That thing was looking at us. And again, Rich could see it with his naked vision. I could see it in the night vision, and we all could see it through the thermal. So that was like 3 different ways we were seeing this animal. And it just stood there, hung there, held onto this tree, and watched us for a really long time. And it wasn't close enough that we could go do anything. It was pretty thick in there. So if we had started to go towards it, it would have taken off. So we just were keeping an eye on it and seeing what it was doing. All it was doing was watching us. And that's a thing that we've experienced again and again in Area X. They just want to like keep an eye on you. They just want to watch you. And that's what this thing was doing. Eventually I got up, I had to relieve myself and I didn't even think about it. I just looked in that direction with my red headlight on. And as soon as I did that, Rich saw it drop to the ground and I could hear it take off. But that whole encounter probably took 15, 20 minutes. And it's just so interesting because I think it shows how patient these animals are. That thing had climbed up onto that tree. We didn't hear a peep as it did it. And it just sat there. It would have sat there all night watching us if we hadn't seen it. Again, they're just very patient animals and probably one of the most super interesting things that's happened to me down there.
And you said out of all these visuals, there was another one that you thought was pretty interesting. Let's talk about that. And any other things that you can remember as far as behavior that stuck out to you, maybe even outside of the visuals that you experienced?
Yeah, so I think the absolute best visual I had was, again, through thermal. It was one night, my friend Brandon was there, Brandon Lentz, and a few other guys, 3 other guys. And we were in the original compound area that the NAWAC used to operate out of in Area X. It was like 105 degrees during the day. It was very warm for that part of the country. That night, we just wanted to sit around in the dark. It turned into a thing, sitting around camp with no lights. And it really happened after this night because as we were sitting there, and this was Brandon's first week in the valley. He had been there for a long weekend in the winter, but this was his first time in during the summer. And so we're sitting around and it's so dark, man, we can't even see each other. And we're just sitting in a circle, right? And Brandon's scoping around with the thermal. And he says that he sees a heat signature. He thinks he sees an animal. From my perspective, it was off to my right and behind him. And I'm like, okay, newbie, let me see this thing that you think is an ape. And I put the thermal to my eye. And Brian, I'm telling you, as soon as it touched my eye, I saw an ape. Pointy head, broad shoulders. It was standing between 2 trees. And what was confusing to me at the time is that it wasn't as bright as I thought it was going to be. The trees were super bright white. And that's just because they were the hottest thing in the image, because they've been standing out in the sun all day long and it was ridiculously warm. So I saw this thing and I'm like, okay, I see your ape. I see it. It's behind the woodshed. I said, no, it's over by the outhouse. And I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. That's the woodshed, not the outhouse. So anyway, we had this sort of Keystone Cops moment where we were passing the thermal back and forth, and he was saying the thing was by the outhouse. And I'm saying, no, you're wrong. It's behind the woodshed. Well, one of the interesting bits of behavior, I don't know if it's behavior, but it's an observation we've made in those valleys, in that part of southeastern Oklahoma, is we very often see these animals together in pairs. You very often see more than one, which is unusual. I think if you look at the data, and especially the Pacific Northwest, it's very often what you're seeing is a solitary animal. But down there, if you're seeing an ape, there's a very good chance that there's another one around, because there are a lot of accounts of two apes being seen at the same time. And usually it's a much larger one and a smaller one. Smaller being like the size of you and me, and the larger one being like 8 feet tall. So I don't know if those are like mated pairs. I don't know. Bob and Kathy Strain and I had a visual of that were actually a normal human size and maybe a little smaller. So I don't know if you're looking at young. I'm not exactly sure. But in this particular instance, I was just blown away by how classically Bigfoot shaped, it's like that image behind you, except the head was pointier and between these two trees. And I'm like, I got to the point where I was shining a flashlight on that spot, and it was a good, gosh, I'm not good with distance and it's been a while, but it was many yards away, probably 30, 40 yards, something like that away. And it was up a slope. So I would put my flashlight on it and I didn't see anything. I saw the trees clear as day, but it was just like gray nothing in between the trees. And I couldn't figure that out, because when I put the scope to my eyes, I could see it perfectly. And when I put the light up there, all I saw was gray. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go up there. I'm just going to go up there. And that's the difference between Brian now and Brian back in 2003, whenever it was. I would never have gone up there in 2003. But now I'm like, I got to know what I'm looking at. So I put the light on it, the white light on it, and I started walking at it in a straight line. I walked across the fire pit, which didn't have a fire in it. I just could not see it with my eyes. And once I got to the bottom of the slope, it moved. And then I'll tell you, man, like every hair in the back of my neck stood up, because that ape had been standing there the whole time, but it was gray. So I couldn't see it. The things that you hear historians talk about at the beginning of World War I is that the German army's uniforms were gray. And one of the reasons they were gray is because you couldn't see them as well. It was a really early form of camouflage. It was just using a color. And this animal was gray. And until it moved, I could not see it. And then I saw it step out behind the tree and presumably walk away along the slope. And that just freaked me the hell out, because it was so big and it filled up this whole thing. And I realized that I was seeing it the whole time. I was just seeing the color of the thing. So that was probably the best visual I've ever had, just because it went on for, gosh, I don't know, Brandon would probably remember better, but it was probably like 10 minutes that we were arguing. And then we figured out, when we compared notes, the animal he was seeing was down on the ground, getting closer to us. And again, this is what they do. They sneak up on you. They want to just observe. I don't know why. I think they just find us endlessly fascinating. But his animal wasn't the one I was looking at all. His animal was down on the ground closer to us. And what happened is that animal up on the slope was watching over the other one that was getting closer to us. That's the best guess that I have at this point. So we were actually seeing two different animals. One that was way closer to us, that's the one that Brandon saw, and then the one up on the slope, the one that I saw.
That's one thing that I haven't asked anybody else really that I've interviewed from that area outside of, I think I asked Kathy the question because she'd seen some that were a lot smaller, like you mentioned, is the size of these things. You guys are normally seeing them at least 2, possibly 3 at a time, and they're different sizes. Just about every encounter that I've ever documented, I'm 300 plus episodes in on this show, of people who have had experiences with Sasquatch, and almost without fail, it is this overwhelmingly large, hulking figure, 8-9 feet tall. I've even had people say possibly 10 feet tall, 800 to 1,000 pounds. Yeah. And yet, when I'm talking to you guys from Area X, Daryl described it when I talked to him. I think he used the word core. He called it a core area for these things, is his theory on it, as in they may be breeding there in that area, and that's what you guys are seeing, maybe smaller juveniles. Is that the case? As far as I know, you spent a ton of time there. As far as what you saw and the other visuals that people had while you were there that you're aware of, is there a lot of difference in the size? Are there, like you said, maybe 8 feet tall and then down to even smaller ones? Is there a pretty good mixture there?
Yeah, for sure. We've clearly seen really big ones. We've seen really big ones, but I remember one time I saw one that was peeking at me from behind a tree, and it couldn't have been any bigger than me. And there's other guys that have been in there, people that I know, who have seen chimp-sized ones, little tiny ones. Kathy saw a little one jump from top of a tree to another tree. So I think that the term the biologists use is a refugium. It's a place where these animals feel that they can go and reproduce and do domestic things and make more animals. And that's my operating assumption about the place, is that for whatever reason, these valleys, and it's not just the one valley the NAWAC works in. The valley that I've been in most recently is next door, and we've had encounters there as well, visuals. So I think that it's this whole sort of region in these mountains where, for whatever reason, the animals feel that they can reproduce and have baby apes and running around. But I think that's a pretty safe assumption at this point, based on the years that I've been in there and based on all the accounts of the people I know. We're seeing them all shapes and sizes. Some really big ones. But I would guess the average size is probably just a little bit bigger than you and me. I don't know how big you are. I'm 6 feet tall, the ones that we're seeing most of the time.
Yeah, you say you're working in the area near there. What kind of encounters are you guys having there? Is it similar to what's going on in Area X? Do you see differences? Do you think it's the same apes traveling from one area to the other?
Man, I wish I knew that answer. My assumption is that at least some of them are the same. There's a ridge that separates these two valleys, and on that ridge, there have been several visuals. I had a very brief visual of a large gray animal up there, but several guys have seen a big gray one up there. It might be the same big gray one. There might be multiple big gray ones. I've probably seen 4 gray animals. None of the visuals have been, except for that one with thermal. There's just no way to know if it's the same animal. That's a $64,000 question. How many of them are packed in there? How many of them are there? And what's their range? If you go to the NAWC website, when I was in the organization, we were able to radio tag an animal. And I think that's the only data that I'm aware of in the world that shows potentially the range of one of these animals. And it was up and over the mountains and around. That's one of the reasons why we felt really comfortable going into the next valley and thinking there would be apes there, is because this animal that was tagged was absolutely all through that region. But I don't know how many are in there. I assume that it's not the same like half dozen apes. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. So I assume that there's a population. I assume that it has to be big enough for breeding and to reproduce successfully. My assumption is these are different apes, but I don't know for a fact. But yeah, in the next valley over, I had a brief visual just last fall, followed by some other guys that were with me. 20 minutes later, a visual of another animal in the same place. So again, a pair. The one that I saw was large and light colored. Probably was gray, if not gray. It was a light colored animal. I'm going to say it was gray. And then the one that the other guy saw was very either dark brown or black. So yeah, they're all over through there. And if I've been going in there since 2007, that means I've been going in there 16 years or something. And I've had 12 visuals, 6 of which I would say are pretty good. The other 6 are pretty fleeting. And that's pretty good. If you think you can go into a place about once a year, see an ape, we're talking about John Green. John Green never saw an ape. He never got to see one. That's remarkable. So either there's a very concentrated population of them, or for whatever reason, as soon as somebody who used to be in the NAWAC shows up, they just start following you around, which doesn't make any sense at all, right? I think there must be a pretty significant population in there.
You mentioned Tag 7, and I want to talk a little bit about evidence, because that's something that's come up in a couple of the conversations I've had with people who have spent a lot of time in those valleys, is the evidence, right? I know for the NAWAC, their mission for the longest time, and part of that mission still is to collect a specimen. According to Daryl, they're switching that into more of people carrying cameras. Daryl told me he doesn't carry a long gun anymore. He carries a camera because he's trying to get some footage of these things, some good photo documentation. I know over the years, there was an incident that Bob mentioned. I can't remember the name of what he called it, but where one of these things was injured. I think it might have actually been Daryl that took a shot at this thing. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we called it the ego incident.
And I know there was some blood collected in that. But over the time, you've been going in there since 2007. What has been the most impressive thing, obviously, other than people actually seeing these things, which is pretty rare in and of itself for someone to have a visual sighting? What kind of evidence has come out of there that has really stood out to you that either you've been really proud of or you've seen collected that has moved the ball down the field in your mind as far as the research goes?
There's been hair collected. Hair is problematic because you have to have a type specimen. There is no type specimen. That's what you always get to whenever you have these conversations, and why I do believe that eventually it's going to require the collection of some kind of specimen, some kind of either a part of one or something. And I think blood might do it. I don't know. I'm not a scientist by training in any stretch of the imagination. But what you get back to is that there's nothing to compare this stuff to. So there's been hair collected. It's not a great place to collect footprint evidence. The ground just isn't conducive. I don't know if you've ever been over there in that part of the country, but the ground is very hard, very rocky. There just isn't a lot of dirt or mud. So it's hard to collect footprint evidence there. The overwhelming amount of just personal accounts. I've had rocks thrown at me. Is that evidence? I don't know. A rock was thrown at me. A rock was thrown at several people. I think tag 7 has got to be just head and shoulders the most important thing that's been collected in Area X. One of the most important pieces of evidence collected with regards to wood apes ever. Because again, this is an animal, the way this tag was situated, the testing was done on the way that the tag was actually affixed to, and how it would affix itself to fur. And we tested it. I didn't have anything to do with it, but it was tested on feathers. So it wasn't a bird. It couldn't have been an animal that was under 6 feet tall because it was at least 6 feet high up on the ground. That was an ape that got tagged. Not only is it the first time, I think, that an animal tagged itself. When this happened, I did a search for that. Never seen an account of that before. Usually, when you're radio tagging animals, you're literally catching them and sticking it on them and then letting them go. But you're talking about turtles, usually things like that, not 8 foot tall bipedals. This animal not only tagged itself, but we collected data for months and months. That data, I think, is just really critically important. It definitely shows a range for this animal. And it was over several months from summer through winter. So I think that has to be the most important data that the NAWC has ever collected. As many cameras as have been deployed by people all across the country, I've never seen a super compelling photo of a wood ape off of a game cam, one that would make someone who was on the fence get off the fence. We've recorded lots of audio down there, not only the NAWAC, but the folks that I'm going in there with. We've got some really interesting audio, whoops and things like that, howls. It's more of the same. Those whoops and howls have been recorded all over the place. If the folks in the Olympic Peninsula and the really terrific work they're doing, recording audio and just gathering evidence of nests and things isn't going to move a needle, then really, and a tag 7 doesn't do it, you start to have this circumstantial body of evidence that just is overwhelmingly indicative of an animal. And you almost have to be obtuse to not want to believe that it's true. I recently heard, I think it was on Cliff and Bobo's podcast, but Matt Pruitt was talking about how the problem with Bigfoot evidence is that there's no such thing as Bigfoot. So any evidence that shows that there might be Bigfoot can't be true because there is no Bigfoot, because there's this logical circle that you get into. And I think that's true. As much as I respect Daryl, and I'm not familiar with why he made the decision he's made to no longer carry a gun in there and try to collect a specimen, I do think that's ultimately how it's going to get resolved. I don't think it's going to be another video or a photo or another footprint cast. If guys Cliff Brackman haven't cracked the nut with all of the casting that he's done, that's not going to do it. So I don't know that there is anything that is going to solve this mystery, that's going to answer this question, that doesn't involve flesh and blood.
I definitely agree, man. That's something I was talking to Bob about just the other day. I think anybody who goes out and is really trying to prove that the species is real, and that's something I want to ask you in just a second as far as the motivation for you. Yeah. But I think anybody who goes out, and I'm not talking about armchair researchers like me who goes hiking on my property. I don't carry a long gun with me. I'm not trying to take down a Sasquatch. Right. And I found things here. There's possibly activity on my property. I found what I believe to be a footprint just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm still up in the air, right? Because I haven't seen one of these things. But I think any group that goes out and doesn't keep that in mind, if you're really trying to move the ball and you're really trying to prove the species, somebody in that group has to have the intestinal fortitude to say, somebody might have to take this thing down because science requires what it requires. I've asked this question of a couple of people recently on the show because I'm very curious about it. What motivates you to go out and continue to go out in the woods? What is the motivation for you? What's the end game for you? Is it to prove the species? Is it to have more experiences? Is it to move that ball for everybody else? What's the motivation for you?
It's interesting because it's changed over the years. At first, when I first started going into the woods, this was before I went to Oklahoma for the first time and met all those guys. I was just like super curious, like I believed that the preponderance of evidence suggested that this animal existed, but I didn't know for a fact that it was real. And so I was going out there to just try to see for myself and have a good time. It was camping with a little bit of flair just because there might be a big old monkey behind the tree or something. then getting to Area X and learning about the apes there, I think that my sort of personal motivation became, I just wanted everyone to know about this. So all of the podcasts that I did, it was always about trying to educate people. And in that way, I was really inspired by the work of people like John Green, who I think that's what his life work was all about, just trying to educate people. And so in some small way, I'm not comparing myself to John Green, but in some small way, I was following in his footsteps and just wanting to get as much information about these things out there as possible. So my personal motivation shifted from being just interested in the topic from a popular culture standpoint to being more interested in the topic from, I want people to know about these things. And especially once I started having my own encounters and I knew for a fact that they were real, I really wanted to protect them, protect their habitat. I know that some people just cannot wrap their head around the fact, like, you think one should be collected as a specimen, but you're trying to protect them. That's how it works. That's how science works. You're not talking about the individuals, you're talking about the population. And so I wanted them protected as a population. Now, I'm in a much smaller group now, and we don't have private land to operate on. I think that my personal motivation, I've really shifted. I keep thinking about this thing that Rick Knoll said to me a long time ago. I asked him what he would do if he ever saw one, because at that point he had not seen one. I'm not sure if he has up to this point, but he had not seen one. And this was back in the early 2000s. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I'll probably just disappear. I'll just stop doing it. I'll go quiet, because like he just wanted to see one. That was his whole thing for doing it. And at this point, the reason I go out is I'm still interested in talking to people. Like I'm talking to you, right? I still want people to understand about this subject. I also know that what I'm capable of doing is really more personal. I go out there for the fellowship to be with my friends. I go out there to be in nature. I really like being in nature, camping and that sort of thing. And I just want to keep having experiences. I want to occasionally see an ape or hear an ape or smell an ape or have a rock thrown at me. So it's become much more personal, I think, as I've gotten older and as things have just evolved around me.
And that's something I ask myself every day. I started doing the show for the very same reason that you did. I wanted to educate people and myself and connect with people who had experiences that hopefully I could learn from. I consider myself an archivist in a way, because everybody I talk to who's had an experience it's out there in perpetuity forever. Once the episode airs, anybody can listen to it and compare it to their own experiences or experiences that happened 15, 20 years ago. And that's one of the things that just keeps me coming back, is putting those dots together and talking to people and listening to what happened to them, and what happened to you in Oklahoma happened to someone in Louisiana. Very similar things, right?
I think about way back in the day when I first started the forums and that sort of thing. For me, it was like trying to convince people that I wasn't crazy, that there was a real good reason to be interested in this subject and that I wasn't nuts. And then what's really interesting to me is as I became more certain that these animals were real, once I started to have experiences and saw them and smelled them and heard them, my interest in trying to convince someone who didn't believe, trying to argue with a skeptic, I became less and less interested in that over time, which is not the thing that I expected to happen. Like at this point, I don't care. I don't care if you don't believe me. I don't care if you think that anyone who goes out looking for Bigfoot is nuts. It doesn't matter to me. Think what you want to think. But I know what I know. I know what I've experienced. And I'm just trying to experience it again. You know what I'm saying? So it's a real evolution. I think it's really, and I remember when folks used to show up on the forum and they've had an experience and they would say something like that. They would say, I don't care if you believe me. I'm like, how could you not care if someone believes you? Like that, it didn't make any sense to me, but now I totally get it. I'm right there with them.
Let's take a left turn here for a second. I didn't even have this written down to talk about, but it's fresh on my mind because it's been a thing that I've been dealing with recently. And somebody who has done as much as you have in this research, I'm curious about how you handle this, because I'm having a difficult time running the show, is dealing with what people call, who was it yesterday told me they don't talk about woo anymore. They call it high strangeness. I was a guest on another podcast, Discover Sasquatch, and Chris was like, I don't call it woo, I call it high strangeness, because I've experienced that recently with some of the people I've interviewed. There was a guy I interviewed that started out with what seems to be a mundane, just seeing an 8-foot ape in the woods that's not supposed to, that turned into a situation where he claims to have sex with a female Sasquatch during his encounter. That's pretty high strangeness as far as I'm concerned when it comes to a Bigfoot encounter. And I'm looking this guy in the eyes, and he is as serious as a heart attack telling me the story. Right. And it's very cathartic for him. He's unburdening himself and telling me the story. I had a conversation with, I don't know if you're familiar with Henry Franzoni, a couple of days ago. Henry has had some weird shit happen to him. There's some things that he wouldn't even tell me because he literally said, I'm not going to put it out there because people think I'm crazy enough already. I'm not going to tell you everything that's happened to me. As a person who goes in looking for wood apes, we're not even talking, you guys don't even call them Sasquatch, Bigfoot. You guys call them wood apes because that's what you believe that they are. And if they exist at all, I think we're on the same track with the wood ape, right? Matt and I have had numerous conversations about that over the years. But I said all that to say, how do you handle that as a researcher, as an investigator, whatever you want to call it, just for yourself? How do you look at those experiences that people convey and compare them to what you've experienced and other people experience? How do you separate the high strangeness, or do you separate it from just regular, let's say, Area X encounters with wood apes?
Yeah. It used to really bother me, again, because I was so invested in trying to demonstrate that I wasn't nuts for believing this, that when people said crazy things like they've had sex with Bigfoot, and again, I don't know this guy, I'm just like, why would you want to? It used to really bother me. And now I think that what's interesting about this is, unless you're having the experience, if I'm telling you what I experienced, if I'm relating to you, you're hearing what my brain did with that. And we're really complicated animals. And I will say that the first time you see an ape, even like for me, I was so close to 100% sure that they were there before I saw one. I totally bought it. And then I saw one. And there's been a couple of times, especially towards the beginning, when I would see one where it was really, it does things to your head, right? Because you're seeing this animal that is a myth. It is a legend, right? It's a monster, and you're seeing it. And even if you think you're prepared, you're not prepared. And this is the advice I give to people who go out there for the first time. You're not ready. You think you're ready, you're not ready to see this thing. The first time you see it, you're going to be an idiot. You're going to do something stupid. That first time I saw an ape, I did something stupid. You're just not ready for it. And so I think what I'm trying to get at is everybody's going to react differently. I think we're very complicated creatures inside our own heads. And I think that the enormity of having one of these experiences, it can mess with you. And I think that there's also an aspect of it that if they're real, I know they are, they're just animals. How come we can't get a picture of one? How come they're so hard to see? How come they can sneak up on you the way they do? How come they can move so fast? Our frame of reference, especially as modern humans, is not one that allows us to understand those things very well. I will say, and I've said it before, that these animals are just faster than you can imagine. They're faster than you can imagine. They can move so quickly. They are a blur. They're so fast. They're so fast that if you were on the edge of believing anything about them being supernatural, that might put you over the top. You might go, yeah, no animal can move like that. And sometimes they can move and make no noise at all. I have no idea how they do this. Sometimes they move and they're ridiculously loud, but sometimes they're super quiet. They're really smooth when they run because of their way their bodies work and the biomechanics of their move. They don't move up and down like you and I do. They're very smooth. They're very fast. They can be deadly quiet. They can just disappear. And some people think they literally do because to them, that's what it looks like. It looks like they just literally disappeared. I've been out in the woods and I've seen deer and they've literally disappeared in front of me. I know they didn't. I just don't know where they went. And that's what these animals do too. So I guess what I'm saying is we're just not prepared as modern humans to understand how animals in the woods work. We're not prepared to understand how an 8-foot tall animal can sneak up on us like that. And I think for some people, the easiest way to explain all that is to allow themselves to go places that make no sense to some of us. I'm not going to throw stones. I live in a glass house, right? I've said I've seen Bigfoot 12 times, right? So I'm not going to throw stones at these folks, but I'm just trying to explain somehow what might get you to a place like that, where you might actually believe that you had sex with a Bigfoot. Where you could tell a guy and you can see it in his eyes that he really believes it. Like, it's just, what's the point?
Yeah, I agree, man. And that's a fair answer. It's subjective like everything else that we're really talking about for the most part with these things. I've often wondered, and I'm actually trying to put together a show now with some mental health professionals that are fans of the show. Some of them have been guests on the show that have a background in mental health to talk about why some of these things happen. Do I believe all Bigfoot is a mass hallucination? Absolutely not. Right. Do I believe some people make up their stories? I do. Right. I believe, like some hoaxers, I believe people have real experiences, like you said, and maybe the brain processes it in a different way than most of us might, and it becomes more fantastical and it gets added to over time. Again, I have everybody on the show to share their experiences, and it is your experience. I do not sit in judgment of anybody's experience, no matter how highly strange it might be.
Right.
And I want to convey that to everybody. It is your experience. I haven't aired the episode with the sex with the Sasquatch because I'm afraid that people won't take it so well. This is a serious show. We try to cover serious things and approach the subject in the right way.
Here's an example of the weird way our brain works. And this is my own personal experience. When Brandon and I had our visual with the thermals and he was seeing the animal down low and I saw the one up on the slope. The thing that I didn't tell you about that, but I have related this in publicly before, but I would not even write that down. The way that we operate out there is we write everything down. We have these journals, and I think it's super important. If you're going in the woods and you're looking for wood apes, write everything down. When it happened, the time that it happened, what all the conditions, it's really important. But when we were sitting there and I had that visual and it was clearly an ape and my hair stood up in the back of my neck, I refused to write it down. I don't know why. There was something happening in my head that would not accept that what I just saw had happened. It wasn't until the next day that I'm like, okay, that happened. And I felt comfortable. And again, dude, I had already seen wood apes. This wasn't my first rodeo, right? I had been coming into the valley for a couple of years at that point. And I can't explain it. I can't explain what happened. If it had been me and one other person, it would have been one of what I think is probably the majority of encounters never would have been reported, never would have been heard by anyone because I would not have accepted it. And for whatever reason, my mind was rejecting that visual, that encounter that I had. It just would not accept it. That's just the kind of weird crap that our brains do to us. And it like I said, it wasn't until the next day that I was able to really come to grips with what I had seen. That doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't make any sense. Similarly, I think the first time I actually saw an ape was through night vision. It was at the end of a clearing. It was maybe 30 yards away from me. And I saw the silhouette of the thing, like the head and one side of it. The rest of it was in the trees. And I didn't say anything to anyone. I just went and sat down in my chair. Like I didn't say anything. It was too much for me. This is why I know for a fact the first time when you're not ready for it, because I was there to see wood apes and I saw one and it just freaked me out too much. I didn't go towards it. I didn't do a damn thing. I didn't put a light on it. I just like, oh, okay. I turned around, sat in my chair. Yeah.
What you just said makes a whole lot of sense to me because I tell you, and I may have said something about this on the show before, it all starts to run together and become a blur after so many episodes. But I can tell you that makes sense because as a police officer, I was involved in a couple of shootings on duty. I was shot at a couple of times. I never had to fire my weapon. I never had to shoot anybody. But I had a really close friend of mine who was involved in an officer-involved shooting, and they had to take a suspect down. And one of the things that I did with him was pull him aside immediately, ask him a couple of questions, and then told him to go sit in my patrol car and tell him not to speak to anybody. Because one of the things that we were trained to do as a police officer, if you're involved in a really high stress situation like that, your brain does exactly what you just described. It completely shuts down and omits half of what and most of everything you hear, and all your other senses just go out the window. One of the things that we were always taught in the academy, if you're involved in a situation like that, particularly in an officer-involved shooting, you do not give a statement for at least 1 to 2, possibly 3 sleep cycles after that incident before you can actually sit down and be able to mentally and cognitively recall every detail and be able to give an account of what happened. So I think that's a really important thing for Bigfoot researchers as well, is process what you saw, think about what you saw, keep it to yourself, have a sleep cycle or 2, and then try to recall what you saw and, in your case, convince yourself that's really what happened. So I think that's a really good point that you brought up. I want to be respectful of your time, but I definitely want to get into this. Most people have probably heard the episode that I did recently. I've been trying to get Rob Lowe on the show to talk about Bigfoot for months now. And I know you got to spend some time with him out at Area X. I actually read a brilliant synopsis of that interaction that you wrote. I read it out on the air a couple of weeks back. Would you entertain us with that and recount that time when Rob Lowe and those guys came to town in Area X? What happened?
Yes. It was amazing. They reached out. This is back when I was still in the NAWAC and I was on the board of directors, and they had reached out multiple times trying to get us. I think that either Rob or one of his kids had seen the monograph that the group put out. And so they were aware of, maybe they listened to some of the podcasts or something. So they were aware of what we were doing, and they really badly wanted to be in Area X with us. So they kept persisting. And We finally negotiated, okay, fine, you give us a donation to the group. And they finally said they weren't telling people when they were setting up the shows who was on the show, but they said, look, this is Rob Lowe, and he's really serious in the subject. Like he's been thinking about Bigfoot for a whole long time. So anyway, we finally said, okay, fine, give us a donation to the group and we'll take you in there. And they showed up. It was like, there were like 6 different vehicles. They just come pouring out like the Marines, right? Like we didn't know what to expect. We thought maybe they'd show up, say hi, then we start filming, whatever. No, these guys, like the crew shows up, the cameras are on, the mics are up. And then Rob and his 2 sons show up in this Ford Raptor, this F-150 Raptor, and they come out and we are filming immediately. No introductions, no nothing. So that when you see it on the show, unless saying, hey, Rob, that's literally when we're meeting Rob Lowe and his kids. It was super freaky. And then we took him in. We took him into the woods. We didn't take him into Area X proper just because it's really hard to get into. We took him into the valley next door, which is where I spend most of my time now. And it was so weird. You're in there. I remember we're driving down this forest road and there's multiple camper vans because they have to have their dressing rooms. There's a caravan of 6 or 8 vehicles plus our truck. So there's probably 10 vehicles in this caravan. And there was this family on ATVs driving by and they were looking at us like we were the circus or something. They were not expecting to see this whole string of cars coming through these old deserted forest roads. Anyway, we went in there and on the road going in there, there's one part in particular that is absolutely horrible. And we found like a nut crushing station. And it might look like it's something we prepped for the show or something. It's not. Like we were driving along and I don't remember who spotted it first. It wasn't me, but somebody spotted it out of the side of the car. And that's what it was. It is a thing that we found many times in those valleys. You'll find a big rock with a little rock on top, and underneath the rock, there's like the remains of nuts because chimpanzees do the same thing. So we showed him that, and it just, you're sitting there, and I don't remember if that made it in the show or not. I think it might have. I'm talking to Rob Lowe about this. Like this guy was on West Wing. He was on some of my favorite movies in the 80s. There was another bit later on where I got to walk with him in this loop that we did. And I'm like, I am walking with Rob Lowe. It just took a while for me to really grok what was happening. But I remember the reason why I wrote that specifically was because there was a moment. It was Rob and I and the sound guy and Brandon Lentz. I think it was just the 4 of us. And we were walking along and we heard 2 whoops. There was a return call across the creek and they were beautiful whoops, just gibbon whoops. Exactly what if you Google gibbon whoop, it was exactly what it was. They were gorgeous whoops. There was some confusion because we were lost. That was literally the first time I had been in that part of the valley. I had no idea where I was. And for some reason, I was leading this Hollywood celebrity through the woods and I didn't know where I was. So we were lost and we came around a corner and there was Mike Mays. And I think Rob had gotten confused because he had asked Mike if that was him that made the whoops. Now, that's not how anybody in that group operated back when I was in it. Like we didn't do that to each other. We weren't trying to trick one another. So I didn't have any doubt in my mind that it wasn't real what we heard, but Rob didn't know that. So he asked Mike if it was him. And I think he misunderstood Mike that it was him, though it wasn't. So if you watch the show, the way they edited the show is they edited it so that Rob was correct. They edited it so that Rob's misunderstanding didn't, confuse anyone. And I didn't think that was right because that's not, Mike didn't whoop. He didn't fake us out. But just that sort of whooping experience and then and they got it on, this is the thing that drives me nuts, man. They got it on audio. Because the audio guy, I heard it back at camp. They got the whoops on audio. They're beautiful. They're crystal clear. But they didn't make the show because they had to edit it to make it feel like it wasn't real because Rob thought it wasn't. But yeah, that was a crazy experience. That night we were, at some point the crew had to leave because they were all union and the time was up. The director took everyone back out and then it was just us and the Lowe's. And then the director came back and then he was doing all of the filming. I think it was, I forget which one of the kids it was, but it was Brandon and maybe Daryl and one of the sons. And they were a little bit away from camp and Brandon had a thermal and he saw what we now know is an ape. At the time, he wasn't sure what it was. He thought it might've been the director because the director was like roaming around and on the road and stuff. But it turns out he saw an ape. He saw an ape sort of head and shoulders of this thing through the thermal. And so he had come back to camp and was telling us this story about how he had seen it. And then I'm like, where was it? And he points like right over there. And where he pointed, like when he pointed over there, we saw 2 little points of light that looked like eye shine. And we've been talking about eye shine with them. And that was just like, oh my God, there's an ape. Because that's where he said he saw it. And as soon as he pointed at it, we saw this eye shine. It wasn't eye shine. We didn't know what it was at first because it was like lights in the woods. it turned out that it was these overlanders that were coming from an area that we didn't even think it was possible for people to be coming from. And that was just so freaky and weird, that whole experience. I remember one of the kids in particular was super freaked out because we didn't know what was going on and we were supposed to be the experts. And if we were freaked out, he was super freaked out. That was a moment of high strangeness. And it was completely understandable in retrospect. But at the time, it was super duper weird. But yeah, just hanging out with those guys out there was great. I don't know why they made that show. It was a good show. A lot of the episodes I really liked. I think our episode was pretty good too, though the editing was a little suspect. But I don't blame him. Hanging out with your kids, doing cool shit like that. That sounds great to me. I would totally do that.
Yeah, I thought it was a really cool story, man. Do you think he left a believer after he spent time at Area X?
Well, I think all three of them were, yeah. We heard all kinds of cool shit that night. We heard whoops, and sometimes we'll hear this real low, like, sound, and they heard that. There was Brandon's visual in the thermal. I don't have any doubt in my mind that they left thinking that these apes were real. And so the funny story is, some of that's funny, but then a couple of months later, I was in LA, and one of his sons, I posted a picture on Instagram, and one of his sons like, "Hey, are you here?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "I'm staying at this." And we were staying at the Beverly Hills Hilton, that's where we were staying. And he's, "Oh, I'm right over here. Like, I'll just come by and say hi." So I'm with people I work with. I'm with like, two of the people work for me, so they know about my interests, but this other one didn't work for me. He had no idea. So anyway, I'm like, okay, Rob Lowe's kid is going to come by for drinks. Like, I met him a couple of months ago. I didn't want to get into it. So then he shows up and we start talking about stuff. We start talking about X and all that kind of stuff. And this guy who is like my work friend, right? Like a guy that he's like a colleague that doesn't work for me. He's like sitting there, like just ordering more drinks. Like, I cannot believe what he's hearing. Like, but me talking to Rob Lowe's kid, we're talking about Rob Lowe and Bigfoot and what? It's like crazy. And we're in the bar of the Beverly Hills Hilton. And then a few months after that, I have some clients in town. This friend of mine is with us and he brings it up in front of my clients. And now pretty much everybody knows. Not only have I been on TV with Rob Lowe talking about Bigfoot, showing him Bigfoot stuff, but everyone I know is aware now because of this TV show. Like, there are no more secrets for me. Everyone's in on it.
The Bigfoot is out of the bag, Brian.
Yes, it is. It's very dangerous.
You can't put that back in the bag after it's out. So do you have anything that's going on outside of your research? Are you writing a book? Are you back in the podcast game? Do you have anything coming up that you want to talk about?
No, man, I am so busy at work right now. I don't have any I may be the only guy who's not writing a book. I hear that Matt Pruitt's got his book coming out, and I really am looking forward to reading that because Matt's one of the smartest guys I know in this field. So that's going to be good. I'm not writing anything. I'm just going out with my friends. We have a group, a Wood Ape research group. We're going out a couple times a year, doing our thing. I'm not podcasting. Again, I just don't have the time for that stuff anymore. So now I'm semi-retired, I guess. That's how I would describe myself.
I definitely appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to me, man. I've been looking forward to this conversation. It was definitely a blast. So I really do thank you for taking the time to come on and share your stories, man. I've had a blast.
It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.